All right, welcome to the Week 15 Forum. This week we are looking at the last chapter of the Martin text, which offers informed speculation on likely future trends in terrorism and political violence. This chapter is divided into four parts. One is an overview of near-term projections. Two offers potential emergence of new threats. Three suggests, unilateral and international counter-terrorist operations. And four, an appraisal of future threats to the U.S. at home and abroad. In the first section, Martin cites an influential article by David C. Rappaport, who elaborated a theory postulating that history has witnessed four distinctive waves of terrorism since the late 19th century. There was an anarchist wave that went from 1880s to 1920, an anti-colonial wave that went from 1945 to the early 1960s, the New Left wave from 1968 to the early 1980s, and then the religious wave, which began in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and goes to the present. I'll be honest, I love David C. Rappaport. He's one of my favorite guys that writes on terrorism. He's written some fantastic stuff. And I wish I'd assigned the Four Waves article for this week. I wish I could find it. From an academic perspective, Rappaport's theory contributes to our understanding of the causes of terrorism. Does anyone think anyone working in counterterrorism in the current administration cares about academic theories? If you were working in the policy field on countering the threat of terrorism, why would you care what Gus Martin or David C. Rappaport, or for that matter, Ken Hicks, thinks about terrorism? I like Martin's discussion of the enduring causes of terrorism. Regardless of the modality, people are going to resort to the kind of violence we call terrorism for a fairly limited set of reasons: marginalization, group aggrandizement, or establishment suppression of dissent. Those three well springs are deep and will continue to provide the bulk of rationales for political terrorism. Martin also discusses fourth-generation warfare as a powerful source of political violence. Significantly, fourth-generation warfare reflects the degeneration of formal rules of war and the proliferation of asymmetrical warfare. The growing prevalence of asymmetrical warfare reflects two trends: the declining utility of interstate warfare as a tool of statecraft, and the growing fragility of nation states in the non-European parts of the world. The lack of legitimacy of many corrupt authoritarian regimes across the globe has given rise to greater levels of political contestation, taking the form of dissident movements, some peaceful, but many violent and revolutionary, including groups that engage in terrorism. So what are the key attributes of fourth-generation warfare? What kinds of threats are posed by destabilizing civil wars and political unrest in most of the world's continents? The second part of the chapter forecasts the future of terrorism. Why does Martin believe that the traditional sources of extremist behavior have not been eliminated and will not be in the foreseeable future? What does he suggest that the new terrorism will replace the old terrorism? What does that mean? What is the significance of groups likely motivated by either marginalization or group aggrandizement resorting to new rather than old terrorism? In reading Martin's analysis of terrorist typologies in the new era on page 430 to 432, which one of these types, state-sponsored terrorism, dissident terrorism, religious terrorism, ideological terrorism, and criminal dissident terrorism, strikes you as the greatest threat? Which poses the most intractable challenge? Martin then surveys regions of the world and analyzes the potential for terrorism in each region. Which region would you view as most vital to U.S. national security? Which region do you think that U.S. engagement of resources would be most likely to produce positive results? Which region would be most difficult for the U.S. to take actions in the world that would yield a good outcome? Which region do you advise policymakers to think twice about committing resources? Let me illustrate, just as a thought experiment. I think the U.S. will continue to have powerful incentives to remain committed in the Middle East, but we should try to do so in a much diminished profile. So that's number one for me. Not really, but again, this is just a thought experiment. Africa, I rank number two. The continent is developing, its regimes are malleable, and those resources will be vital to the United States in the 21st century, over the course of the 21st century. Latin America, I would rank 3, but again, I would be reluctant to make high-profile, kinetic kinds of engagements, but would rather want to invest heavily in improving perceptions of the United States in the region, and economically and try to improve trade ties with nations in Latin and Central America. Improved economic circumstances may help reduce the allure of the drug cartels. The second section of this chapter, and again, that's just my top 3. You make of it what you will. The second section of this chapter deals with new threats in the form of technological innovations. Martin uses the term cyber terrorism and sees it as a plausible threat. I remain skeptical of use of the term cyber terrorism, even as I acknowledge that the internet and social media present opportunities for terrorist groups as force multipliers, coordinating tools, and as recruitment tools. I get it, but I just don't think that's terrorism. I think that's a technology. Elsewhere in this section, Martin analyzes the likelihood of other new technologies, weapons of mass destruction, exotic technologies like electronic or electromagnetic pulse weapons, plastic weapons, things like that as potentials for deployment. What conditions influence the feasibility of these kinds of weapons, getting used in the near future? In the third section of this chapter, Martin addresses the mix of policies that states can employ to combat terrorism, including conventional adaptations, a range of policies, including negotiations, peace talk, and more militarized responses, which can take the form of intelligence or paramilitary operations or overt use of military force. What mix of policies would you advise as a political leader in combating sort of a garden variety military insurgency routinely employing terrorism? Martin analyzes the continued utility of military force. Based on Martin's analysis, when is military force most likely to prove successful? In what situations is military force most likely to produce counterproductive outcomes? Countering dissident terrorist financial operations is a growing priority for most countries' counterterrorism programs. However, Martin reminds us that the estimated cost of the 9/11-2001 attacks was a mere $300,000, and the ability of most democratic states to track sums that small is pretty limited. One of the biggest problems with tracking money used to fund terrorism is that they exploit, customer anonymity, guarantees that banks, which enable and facilitate and foster offshore banking institutions like those operating in the Cayman Islands, or that characterize operations in Switzerland and several of the other microstates. The fact that wealthy people have exploited customer anonymity to shield their wealth from taxation actually works to the benefit of terrorist organizations. Would you advocate closing those kinds of shelters and making it more difficult for the wealthy to get away with hiding their money? How would you go about doing it? What kind of international cooperation would be required to close these shadow banking operations? Martin discusses the prospects for international cooperation. What's the likelihood of ensuring greater cooperation between and among law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and the militaries of nations willing to cooperate on countering the threat of terrorism? I think NATO is an important institution for that. The question again is, to what extent are people willing to kind of work together? There's a lot of mistrust out there. All right. Hopefully I've given you sufficient guidance for discussion this week. If there's anything in this chapter or my mini lecture that confuses you, please bring it to my attention and I'll try to address it in the forum. Let's have a great week.